The nightmare continues. His family becomes the target. 50 miles away, in a quiet Houston suburb, Elena Carter's world was about to be turned upside down. The air was heavy, thick with the humidity of a Texas night. The neighborhood was silent except for the faint chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. No sirens, no warnings. Then, out of nowhere, the night exploded with chaos. 3 black SUVs screeched into the driveway. Doors flew open. A dozen men in black tactical gear stormed out, rifles raised, their red laser sights dancing across the walls of the house. Boom! The front door was blasted off its hinges, the wood splintering inward. Elena barely had time to react before she was slammed to the ground, a heavy knee pressing between her shoulder blades. "Houston PD, stay down," she gasped as her cheek pressed against the hardwood floor, her heart pounding against her ribs. Upstairs, a scream. "Mum!" Jordan. Her 12-year-old son. She twisted her head just in time to see 2 officers dragging him down the staircase, his skinny arms flailing, his face pale with terror. "Let him go, he's just a kid," Elena screamed. A pair of hands yanked her up by the hair, spinning her around. She found herself staring into the smirking face of Sergeant Ed Voss. "You should have married better, Mrs. Carter." A carefully orchestrated setup. 2 officers marched Jordan toward the door, his wrists bound behind his back. His pajamas were twisted, his bare feet dragging against the floor. Elena fought harder, but another officer twisted her arms behind her, yanking on the cuffs until her shoulders burned. "You're under arrest, Mrs. Carter." "For what?" she spat, eyes burning with fury. Voss chuckled, pulling a clear plastic bag from his pocket. A pound of pure cocaine. He tossed it onto the coffee table like a party favor. Drug possession, with intent to distribute. Elena went still. Oh my God. They had set her up. The cameras flashed, capturing the perfect media spectacle, former FBI director's wife and son being arrested in their own home, surrounded by what looked like cartel drugs. And the moment it hit the news, the world would believe it. Gabe watches it all unfold. Back in the Raven Creek holding cell, Gabe sat on the floor, his back pressed against the cold concrete wall. His ribs ached, his wrists throbbed, but none of that mattered anymore. Not compared to the horror unfolding on the television screen across from him. His home, his family. The news anchor's voice was calm, professional. "We have breaking footage from the home of former FBI Director Gabriel Carter, where authorities have discovered a large quantity of illegal narcotics." The footage cut to Elena and Jordan being shoved into the back of separate squad cars. Jordan's tear-streaked face filled the screen. Sources close to the investigation suggest that Carter may have been using his position to traffic drugs. FBI officials have yet to respond to these allegations. The screen faded to black. The world had just watched his wife and son become criminals. Gabe's body went rigid. His knuckles turned white. The rage inside him was no longer just a fire, it was an inferno. Grady was watching. From the other side of the bars, the deputy leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, amusement clear in his pale blue eyes. "Man, you should see your face." Gabe pushed himself up, slow and deliberate. His body screamed in protest, but he barely felt it. "I swear to God, Grady." Grady raised a hand, grinning. "Careful now. Threatening an officer is another charge." Gabe lunged. His fingers barely grazed the bars before a baton smashed into his ribs, sending him crashing back onto the floor. He gasped, pain ripping through his chest. Grady knelt down, tapping the metal against the bars. "You don't get it, do you?" he sighed, shaking his head. "This was never about you. It was about your family. You thought putting Prescott's people in jail would make you a hero?" He chuckled. "Nah, Carter. It just made you a target. And now they were going to burn everything he loved to the ground." Elena fights back. Inside the holding cell at Houston PD, Elena sat on a metal bench, wrists cuffed in front of her. Across from her, a television replayed the news cycle like a broken record. Every station was running the same manufactured story. The door creaked open, and a man in a suit entered. Ray Carver, a high-priced defense attorney, but not hers. "You're going to sign this, Mrs. Carter." He slid a paper across the table. Elena barely glanced at it. A full confession. "Go to hell." Carver sighed, rubbing his temples. "Elena, listen, you don't understand how deep this goes. They don't need you to be guilty. They just need you to play along." Elena's hands curled into fists. She leaned forward, eyes burning with fury. "I am not going to let you take my son." Carver met her gaze without blinking. "You don't have a choice." Gabe's escape plan. Back in the Raven Creek cell, Gabe sat perfectly still. His mind wasn't racing anymore. It was calculating. Every second mattered now. He wasn't just going to sit here while his family was dragged through hell. He needed out, now. His right wrist twitched against the metal cuff. He had noticed something earlier, a weakness in the hinge, something he could use, and he did. With one quick movement, the cuff popped open. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Grady was coming back. Gabe stood, rolling his shoulders. If they thought this was over, they were about to learn how wrong they were. Escape and counterattack, running from the darkness. The breakout. The clock was ticking. Gabe rolled his wrists, shaking off the lingering pain from the too tight cuffs. His breathing was steady, controlled, but inside, he was a storm brewing. His wife and son were in police custody, framed as criminals. The entire country had already decided he was guilty. And now he was done playing by their rules. The single guard stationed outside his cell, a burly officer named Briggs, was flipping through his phone, barely paying attention. Big mistake. Gabe had one shot. The loosened hinge on the handcuffs was a weak point that he had already exploited. With a sharp twist of his wrist, the metal clicked free, falling silently onto the cot beside him. Briggs didn't notice. 1, 2... Gabe took a slow step forward. The moment his foot touched the floor, Briggs looked up. Too late. Gabe exploded forward. His forearm smashed into Briggs's throat, cutting off any attempt to shout. The officer staggered backward, his gun still holstered. Gabe didn't let up. A sharp knee to the gut, a quick pivot, an elbow to the temple. Briggs dropped like a sack of bricks before he could even pull his weapon. Gabe snatched the keys from his belt and unlocked the cell door. In 10 seconds, he was free. But getting out of the cell was the easy part. Now, he had to escape the building. The path to freedom. The hallway outside the cell block was empty, but not for long. He had maybe 3 minutes, max, before someone noticed Briggs was down. Gabe moved quickly but deliberately. His instincts told him security cameras were everywhere, so he kept his head low, his steps light. Through the narrow hallway, past the locked interrogation rooms, into the processing area, was almost there. Then, a voice behind him. "Hey!" Gabe whirled. A rookie officer, maybe early 20s, stood at the end of the corridor, his hand hovering over his gun. "Don't do it, kid," Gabe warned, his voice low and firm. For a second, the officer hesitated. That was all Gabe needed. He lunged forward, closing the distance before the rookie could even draw. A quick strike to the wrist sent the kid's weapon clattering to the ground. Gabe snatched it up, turned and ran. Sirens blared overhead. The entire station was on alert. Time to go. Stealing a ride. Gabe burst into the parking lot, the cool night air hitting him like a slap. 2 squad cars were parked nearby, their engines still running. Come on, come on. Then he spotted it, a black, unmarked sedan. A detective's car. No tracking, no radio. Perfect. Gabe sprinted toward it, wrenching the driver's side door open, keys in the ignition. As he slid in, the doors to the station burst open behind him. "Carter, stop!" Too late. He floored it. The chase begins. The tires screamed as he tore out of the lot, the speedometer climbing fast. In the rearview mirror, 2 police cruisers roared to life, their sirens wailing. They were gaining. Gabe gritted his teeth. He had been in plenty of high-speed pursuits before, but never like this. Never with the entire state hunting him down. The highway stretched before him, a dark ribbon cutting through the Texas night. He pushed the speed to 90, 100, 110 miles per hour. The cruisers stayed on him, their headlights glaring like hungry wolves. "I need a plan." Then he saw it. A construction zone ahead. Perfect. With a sharp jerk of the wheel, he swerved hard right, cutting through the unfinished section of road. Dust and debris exploded into the air as he navigated the rough terrain. The police cruisers followed, but they weren't built for this. One hit a pothole and spun out. The other clipped a cement barrier, the impact sending sparks flying. Gabe was gone, contacting the only person he can trust. 30 miles later, Gabe pulled into an abandoned gas station, his hands still gripping the wheel like a vice. His mind was racing. His family was still in danger. and he had no allies left. Except one. Reaching into the glove box, he found a burner phone, a number he never thought he'd have to call. He dialed. The line rang. Fina voice answered. "Carter, I was wondering when you'd call." Gabe exhaled. "Hayes, I need your help." Deputy Director Isaac Hayson, of the few men in the FBI not owned by Prescott's machine. "I know, I saw the news. They're burying you." Gabe's grip tightened. "They have my wife and kid, Hayes." A pause. Then, "Where are you?" The plan for revenge. Hayes' safe house was an old farmhouse miles outside the city. Off the grid, no cameras, no tracking. Gabe pulled up, stepping out of the car. Hayes stood at the door, arms crossed. "You look like shit." Gabe didn't waste time. "We need to move, fast." He laid it out, the fake drug charges, the doctored footage, the media smear campaign. Hayes listened, nodding slowly. Then, he tossed a tablet onto the table. On the screen, a live feed from a private server. Gabe leaned in. His blood ran cold. Security footage from inside Houston PD. Elena, still in custody. Jordan, in a holding cell, alone, crying. Then the worst part. A group of men entered the frame, not cops, private contractors, hired to make sure the Carters didn't live to see trial. "We need to move, now." Gabe's voice was pure steel. Hayes nodded. "I hope you're ready for war." Gabe loaded his gun. "I've been ready since the moment they came for my family." Gabe is no longer just runnings going to war. Can he take down the men who destroyed his life before it's too late? Hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because this fight is only beginning. A bloody conclusion and the price of justice. The final stand. The night was thick with tension. Gabe sat in the passenger seat of a stolen police SUV, his fingers wrapped tightly around the grip of a Glock 19. His jaw was clenched so hard it felt like his teeth would shatter. Next to him, Isaac Hayes stared ahead, eyes scanning the desolate Texas highway. The old FBI deputy director had seen plenty of bloodshed in his time, but even he knew this was different. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was war. "One last time, Carter, are you sure about this?" Hayes asked. Gabe exhaled, slow and steady. "They came for my family. They left me no choice." Ahead, Houston PD's holding facility loomed against the darkness. Elena was in there, Jordan was in there, and the men who had framed him, the ones who had orchestrated this nightmare, they were in there too. Tonight, it ended, one way or another. Infiltration. The SUV rolled to a stop in an alley behind the station. No alarms, no patrols. But that didn't mean they weren't expected. Gabe slid out, his boots silent on the pavement. The side entrance was locked, not a problem. Hayes knelt, pulling out a device that scrambled the digital keypad. Within seconds, the door clicked open. They slipped inside. The hallway was eerily quiet. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering like they belonged in a horror movie. Gabe moved first, his gun raised. Hayes followed, covering their flank. They reached the holding cells. Through the bars, Jordan, hunched in the corner, arms wrapped around his knees. Gabe's heart twisted. "Dad?" Jordan's voice was barely above a whisper. Before Gabe could respond, a gun cocked behind them. Well, look what we have here." The ambush. Cole Grady stepped forward, flanked by 3 officers. Sergeant Voss stood behind them, smirking. "You really should have stayed buried, Carter," Grady sneered. Gabe kept his gun steady. Hayes did the same, but there was no way out. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and then the fire alarm went off. Sprinklers erupted overhead, water cascading down in a torrential downpour. A distraction, and Gabe took it. He lunged, twisting his body, firing twice. The first bullet slammed into Grady's shoulder. The second took out the officer to his left. Chaos erupted. Gunfire shattered the silence, bullets ricocheting off walls. Hayes dropped another officer, his precision deadly. Gabe turned toward Voss. The sergeant was already raising his gun. Too slow. Gabe fired. The bullet hit Voss square in the chest. The man fell, gasping. And just like the tune of the monsters was dead, the escape. Jordan's cell key was on Voss's belt. Gabe grabbed it, his hands slick with blood and rainwater. The door swung open, and Jordan flew into his arms. Dad Mom's still in interrogation. Gabe's chest tightened. He grabbed Jordan's hand, pulling him toward Hayes. "Get him out of here." Hayes hesitated. "Gabe." "Go," Gabe barked. Hayes nodded. He took Jordan and vanished into the smoke. Gabe turned. He still had one more person to save. The final confrontation. The interrogation room was down the hall. Gabe kicked open the door. Inside Elena, handcuffed to the table, bruised but alive. And across from her, Clayton Prescott, the governor of Texas, the man who had ordered everything. Prescott smirked. "You made it farther than I expected." Gabe didn't hesitate. He raised his gun. "Get up." Prescott chuckled. "And if I don't?" Gabe pulled the trigger. Bang. The bullet shattered Prescott's kneecap. The governor screamed. Gabe kicked the chair aside, grabbed the keys off the table, and freed Elena. "Can you run?" he asked. Elena nodded, and together they ran. The aftermath. The station was in flames. Hayes was waiting outside with a getaway car. Jordan was in the back seat, safe. Elena climbed in. Gabe hesitated, because behind him Grady was still alive. And he was watching, bleeding, barely able to stand, but still smiling. "You think this ends here?" Grady rasped. "You have no idea what you've started." Gabe didn't care. He climbed into the car, and they drove into the night. The price of justice. 2 days later, the truth hit the news. The recordings, the footage, the corruption laid bare. Prescott was finished. Grady was arrested, but the cost. Gabe lost everything. The FBI disowned him. The world would never know the full truth. And as he stood in a motel room, staring at his reflection, he knew justice had come, but at a price he could never repay. The message, the cost of truth. The motel room was silent except for the low hum of the air conditioning unit rattling in the window. Gabriel Carter sat at the edge of the bed, his hands clasped together, staring at the blank television screen. The bruises on his knuckles had started to fade, but the pain, the deep, gnawing ache in his chest was still as raw as the night he lost everything. Outside, the world was moving on. News stations had shifted their attention. The headlines that once screamed his name had been replaced by the next political scandal, the next tragedy, the next distraction. Clayton Prescott was finished. Cole Grady was behind bars, along with the corrupt officers who had framed him. The system had cracked, if only for a moment. But justice, real justice, was never free. And Gabe? Gabe had paid the highest price, the cost of fighting back. He reached for the envelope sitting on the nightstand. Elena's handwriting. His hands trembled as he pulled out the letter. "Gabe, I don't know how to put this into words. You saved us. You fought for us. But we can't keep living in this war. We can't keep looking over our shoulders, waiting for the next fight to come knocking on our door. Jordan needs peace, and so do I. I love you, but I can't do this anymore." Gabe exhaled, slow and steady. The words didn't surprise him. Elena and Jordan were safe somewhere far away, rebuilding their lives without the shadow of this war hanging over them. And Gabe? Gabe didn't get to rebuild. Because men like him who went up against the system and survived, they didn't get to have peace. They only got to keep fighting. Truth is never free. He turned on the television, flipping to a news channel out of habit. They were talking about him again. The fall of Governor Prescott has led to multiple arrests within law enforcement agencies across the state. But the question remains, what does this mean for the future of justice in Texas? Many believe that Gabriel Carter's actions were heroic, exposing corruption at the highest level. Others argue that his methods were reckless, dangerous. Was he a patriot? Or was he simply a man with nothing left to lose? Gabe chuckled bitterly. They were still trying to decide what he was. The truth? He was just a man who refused to stay buried, and that made him dangerous. The real battle, this wasn't over. He could feel it in his bones. For every man like Prescott who fell, there were a dozen more waiting to take his place. For every Grady behind bars, there were officers still wearing the badge, still believing they were untouchable. The system had cracked, but it hadn't broken. Not yet. Gabe grabbed his coat and stood, glancing one last time at the letter in his hands. He folded it neatly, tucking it into his pocket. Then, without another word, he walked out the door. There was still work to be done. This isn't just Gabe's story, it's a reflection of the world we live in. Justice is never easy. The system is built to protect itself, and the people who fight back, they pay the highest price. So what do you think? Did Gabe do the right thing, or was it all for nothing? Let us know in the comments. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications because the truth doesn't stop here.